This was supposed to be the morning I got my family back, 7 days on a Caribbean cruise out of Galveston. The kind of trip you plan when retirement finally gives you space to breathe. I was in my garage in Plano suitcase, open trunk up, moving slow on purpose, because I wanted to savor it. 38 years of working, 1 year of learning how to be still, and I thought this would be my reward, a week with my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson close enough that we could remember how to talk again. Then my phone vibrated. One text from my son Ryan, one line that did not bother with a hello. "This cruise is for family. You are not included." I read it 3 times, waiting for the punchline that never came. I'm Michael Anderson, and on this channel I tell the kinds of stories men don't usually say out loud, the quiet betrayals that happen with polite words and clean hands. I opened my confirmation email just to steady myself, and that was when I saw the cabin numbers had changed. Upgraded. Both of them. Paid for 2 days earlier with the credit card I had trusted Ryan with for emergencies. In that moment I understood something worse than being left behind. I had been removed and still expected to fund the goodbye. I was standing in my garage in Plano, Texas, just after sunrise when the day still felt undecided. The air was cooler than it would be an hour later, and the quiet had that hollow quality it only has before the neighborhood wakes up. My sedan sat with the trunk open, and a suitcase lay on the concrete floor beside it, half filled. I moved slowly, not because my body demanded it, but because I did not want to rush this moment. The cruise felt like a marker in my life. 7 days in the Caribbean, sailing out of Galveston. I had paid for it myself, booked it myself. I told myself it was a reward for 38 years as a mechanical engineer and a year of learning how to live after retirement. More honestly, it was an attempt to pull my family back into the same space, even if only for a week. I folded a pair of shorts and placed them carefully into the suitcase. Dress shoes followed, then a pressed shirt for formal night. I paused when I reached the back seat of the car and picked up a small plastic bag. Inside was a toy car my grandson Lucas had left there weeks earlier. I turned it over in my hand, noticing the chipped paint along the roof. I had meant to give it back to him on the ship. I set it on the workbench instead, and stood there longer than necessary. Retirement had not been what I expected. I had imagined relief space to breathe. Instead, it felt like stepping out of a room while the conversation continued without me. My coworkers had been polite, even warm, but their attention drifted quickly. Family, I thought, would be different. Family always was. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I ignored it at first. I wanted to finish packing, to stay inside the feeling that things were still intact. The phone vibrated again. I sighed and wiped my hands on an old rag before pulling it out. It was a text from my son Ryan. One line. No hello. No explanation. The words were simple and precise. The cruise was for family, and I was not included. I stared at the screen, then read it again. I read it a 3rd time, as if repetition might change the meaning. There was no anger in the message, no argument to respond to. It was written the way you notify someone of a schedule change. Calm. Final. Something settled heavily in my chest. Not fury, not heartbreak in the dramatic sense. It felt more like being quietly reassigned, moved from father to someone on the periphery without anyone bothering to tell me why. I leaned against the workbench and let my arm drop to my side, the phone still lit in my hand. This garage held more of my history with Ryan than any room in the house. He had learned to ride a bike in the driveway. He had watched me fix engines and asked questions that showed he was listening more than he let on. I had believed those moments built a foundation that could not be undone by a single decision. I told myself there had to be context missing. Maybe Ryan thought he was protecting me from obligation. Maybe this was temporary. Those explanations felt thin even as I formed them. I opened the cruise confirmation email telling myself I only wanted to check the boarding time. I scrolled past the itinerary and the dining schedule. Then I noticed the cabin numbers. They were not what I remembered. Both cabins had been upgraded. I tapped into the payment details. The charge had gone through 2 days earlier. It was billed to the credit card I had given Ryan years ago, the one I told him to keep for emergencies. The date of the charge sat quietly beneath the total, lining up perfectly with the day I received the message. I lowered myself to the concrete floor and rested my back against the car. The garage door was still open. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler clicked on spraying water in a steady rhythm. Life continuing at its usual pace while something important shifted under my feet. I considered calling Ryan. I imagined his voice careful and measured. I imagined him explaining that this was what his wife wanted, that it was complicated, that I would understand if I gave it time. I realized how tired I was of understanding. I thought about the down payment I had helped with years ago. The evenings I spent watching Lucas so they could go out. The holidays where I tried not to notice how quickly conversations moved past me. None of those memories felt transactional when they happened. Looking at them now, they took on a different shape. I closed the suitcase but did not latch it. I left it where it was half-packed, unfinished. I walked into the house and poured a cup of coffee, then set it on the counter untouched. Through the kitchen window, I watched a neighbor back out of their driveway, heading somewhere with purpose. When I returned to the garage, the toy car was still on the workbench. I picked it up again and set it inside the suitcase, then stopped and took it back out. I placed it gently on the shelf instead. I looked at the phone once more. I did not reply. I did not delete the message either. I left it there on the screen, letting the words sit where I could see them. I was not angry yet. I was alert. Aware that the rules I thought I lived by had changed, and that before I did anything else, I needed to understand exactly when that had happened. I did not answer Ryan's message that morning. I told myself I needed time to think, but the truth was simpler. I needed to see the whole shape of what had happened before I spoke. When something breaks slowly, you rarely notice the first crack. You only notice the moment it finally gives way. Ryan and Ashley bought their house back in 2018 on the edge of a newer development, where everything still smelled like fresh paint and cut lumber. They were nervous, excited, stretched thin. When the bank hesitated over the down payment, Ryan called me late one evening. He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the worry underneath. I did not hesitate. I transferred the money the next morning and co-signed where the paperwork required it. I told him it was an investment in their future, but what I meant was that it felt good to still be needed. Back then, appreciation came easily. Ryan called with updates. Ashley sent photos of paint colors and half-finished rooms. When Lucas was born, they leaned on me even more. I watched him while they worked long hours and built the version of their lives they wanted the world to see. I did not mind. Sitting on the floor with my grandson felt like purpose, not obligation. Over time, something shifted. The thank yous became assumptions. Watching Lucas was no longer a favor, it was part of the schedule. If I hesitated, Ashley would explain how hard it was to stay consistent online, how momentum disappeared if she stepped away. I nodded and adjusted. I told myself this was what family did. I did not notice when I stopped being asked and started being informed. The first sign came quietly. One afternoon, I took a photo of Lucas holding a small fish we caught at a nearby pond. It was the kind of picture I used to share without thinking. When I went to send it to the family group chat, the thread was gone. I searched my phone, convinced I had deleted it by mistake. Later that evening, Ryan mentioned they had started a new group chat, something simpler, easier to manage. He did not add me back. I let it go. Or I told myself I did. A few weeks later, I found out about Lucas's birthday party through social media. Balloons, cake, friends gathered in their backyard. Ashley wrote about keeping things simple this year. I stared at the photos looking for an empty space that might have been mine. There wasn't one. Around the same time, I stopped by my old office to return a set of keys I had forgotten to turn in. The building felt unfamiliar, as if it had already rewritten itself without me. People smiled politely, then turned back to their screens. A younger engineer asked how retirement was treating me, while already glancing past my shoulder. I realized I had become someone who used to be useful. Over the next few days, the pieces kept falling into place. Not all at once, but enough that I could not pretend they were unrelated. I opened my email to look for cruise boarding details, something concrete to focus on. That was when I noticed a message about travel insurance. It listed my name, my address, my phone number. I had not arranged it. I clicked through the details. Premium coverage, additional services. Everything was correct, right down to the card on file. The same card I had given Ryan years ago for emergencies. The charge date matched the week before, just days after I received the message about being excluded. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the screen dimming in front of me. The coffee I had poured earlier sat untouched. Outside cars passed and neighbors went about their routines. I felt oddly calm the way I used to feel at work when a system failure revealed itself. Once you see the pattern, emotion gives way to clarity. I thought about the conversations I had brushed aside over the years. Ashley talking about efficiency, about how family support should not come with questions. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Now it sounded practiced. What unsettled me was not the money. I had earned it. I could replace it. What unsettled me was how easily my presence had been removed while my support remained accessible. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed myself to be defined by how useful I was, not by who I was. I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the table. This had not happened overnight. It happened in small decisions made without me, in favors that became obligations, in silences that replaced conversations. I walked back into the garage and looked at the suitcase where I had left it. It sat exactly where it had been, half-packed, unfinished. I realized that what I was grieving was not a canceled trip. It was the slow realization that my role had been rewritten without my consent, and that if I did not address it now, the rewrite would continue until there was nothing left to argue for. The understanding I reached did not calm me. It sharpened everything. Once I saw the pattern, I could not unsee it, and the next question pressed in on me until I answered it. I needed to know whether Ryan believed the same things that were now being said in his name. I waited until the afternoon to call him. Long enough for the morning tension to settle and for my own voice to steady. He answered on the third ring. He sounded distracted, polite in the way people are when they expect a difficult conversation and hope to get through it quickly. We talked around the edges at first. Work, traffic, small things meant to delay the moment. When I asked why I was not going on the cruise, the line went quiet. Not dead, just empty. He said it was complicated. He said they were trying to keep things simple. When I asked what simple meant, he cleared his throat and said Ashley thought it would be better this way. The words landed and my chest tightened, a quick, shallow feeling, like stepping into cold water. It was not anger. It was the realization that I had just been removed from the decision itself. He did not say he agreed. He did not say he disagreed. He stood behind the choice and let it speak for him. I asked him what he wanted. He hesitated again, then repeated that Ashley felt strongly, and that he did not want conflict before the trip. I understood then that this was not about avoiding drama. It was about choosing the path of least resistance, even if it meant stepping around me. I told him I understood. I meant that I understood the mechanics of it, not that I accepted it. We ended the call without raising our voices. When the line went dead, I sat in the car and stared through the windshield at the grocery store across the street. People moved in and out with carts and lists and places to be. A father lifted a child into the back seat. The ordinariness of it all made my throat tighten again. Over the next few days, the atmosphere around me shifted. Not dramatically, quietly. A neighbor asked if everything was all right at home, her tone careful, rehearsed. A woman from the HOA mentioned boundaries while we stood by the mailboxes, as if the word itself carried an accusation. No one confronted me directly. They did not have to. Concern travels faster than truth in places like that. I noticed who stopped waving, who lingered just long enough to listen. The story was forming without me, built from fragments and good intentions. I had lived in that neighborhood long enough to know how these things went. Once a narrative took hold, it rarely needed proof. That weekend, I met Tom Reynolds for coffee. We had worked together years ago, back when our days were defined by deadlines and worn tools. Retirement had not softened him. He still sat straight, still listened more than he spoke. We talked about his garden and the heat, and how fast everything seemed to be moving now. Then he looked at me and asked how things were really going. I told him about the cruise, about the call, about the way my role seemed to have shifted without my consent. I did not embellish. I did not need to. He nodded as if he had been waiting for me to finish. He said he had been through something close. Not the same details, but the same shape. Helping his daughter until help became expectation. Saying yes until no felt like betrayal. He said the moment he realized he had become useful rather than valued was the moment he started losing his place. He called it the family ATM. Quiet, reliable, taken for granted until it stopped working. The phrase stayed with me on the drive home. It explained too much, too quickly. That evening, I opened my laptop again and went back through the cruise records. This time, I was careful. I checked timestamps, dates, the order of transactions. The upgrade fee had been processed the same day Ryan sent the message. Not before, not after. The sequence mattered because it showed intent. I closed my eyes and let the information settle. The decision to exclude me and the decision to continue using my resources had happened side by side. There was no confusion there, only convenience. I considered confronting them both. Laying out the facts, asking questions that could not be deflected. But years of solving problems had taught me something else as well. Acting too soon often meant acting without leverage, so I chose not to respond. I did not call Ryan back. I did not comment on anything Ashley posted. I did not correct the whispers or defend myself to people who never asked directly. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to patterns instead of words. Silence, I learned, reveals what arguments often hide. As night fell, I returned to the garage and stood beside the car. The suitcase was still there, exactly where I had left it. I did not touch it. I thought about what it would cost to keep quiet a little longer. About the ground I might lose by not stepping in immediately. I accepted that cost. Some answers only appear when you stop trying to force them, and I knew that whatever came next would require me to see the entire picture before I moved. I did not wake up the next morning ready to act. I woke up weighing the cost of acting at all. There was a part of me that wondered if I was making something larger than it needed to be, if bringing lawyers into family matters was a line I would regret crossing. That thought stayed with me as I showered, as I drove, as I parked in front of a low brick office building just off downtown Plano. David Thompson had been my attorney for years, mostly for quiet things that never made headlines. A will update. A question about property taxes. He was not dramatic by nature, and that was why I trusted him. When I walked into his office, he greeted me the same way he always did, with a firm handshake and an expression that suggested he was listening before I spoke. I told him I wanted to review my affairs. I did not frame it as a crisis. I framed it as maintenance. He did not press me for reasons. He asked what areas I wanted to look at, and I told him everything. We sat across from each other while I explained the situation in plain terms. The cruise, the credit card, the shift I could feel but had trouble naming. David listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down. When I finished, he asked what I wanted the outcome to be. I said I was not looking to punish anyone. I wanted to understand where the risks were and where my responsibilities ended. He nodded as if that answer mattered. We started with assets, my home, my accounts, anything tied to my name that someone else might have access to. David asked about cards I had shared and permissions I might have given casually over the years. He explained how modern banking made it easy for access to linger long after intent had changed. We talked about electronic signatures and scanned documents, how a signature saved for convenience could travel further than expected. He was careful with his words, not alarmist, not dismissive. He explained boundaries the way you explain weather patterns, factual and unavoidable. At one point, he asked about my grandson, Lucas. I told him about the education account I had set up years earlier, a $529 plan I funded quietly every month. It was something I had never talked about with anyone outside the family. David asked who could access it. I hesitated before answering. The pause stretched longer than I meant it to. David explained what control meant in practical terms. Who could make changes? Who could withdraw funds? Which safeguards were automatic, and which depended on documentation? As he spoke, I realized how much I had relied on trust to do the work of structure. I left his office that day with a list. Not of actions, but of questions. It took me a couple of days to gather everything he needed. Bank statements, account summaries, copies of forms I had signed years ago without much thought. During that time, the atmosphere around me continued to shift. A neighbor asked if everything was all right, her voice careful. At the grocery store, two people I knew well stopped talking when I approached. No one accused me of anything directly. They did not need to. Concern has its own way of spreading. When I returned to David's office with the documents, he spread them across his desk and worked through them methodically. He compared dates, access points, permissions. He moved slowly, the way people do when they know speed is the enemy of accuracy. Then he stopped. He picked up one document and turned it toward me. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. The slant was right, the spacing familiar. But something about it felt wrong, too uniform, too consistent. He asked if I remembered signing that specific form. I did not. He checked the file details and explained that the signature had been scanned and stored, not forged, not illegal on its face, preserved for ease of use. The room felt tighter after that, not because something criminal had happened, but because something careless had been allowed to continue unchecked. David said we needed to close some doors. I nodded, though a part of me wondered again if I was overreacting. That doubt passed when I imagined the alternative, doing nothing and hoping clarity would arrive on its own. Over the next few days, we worked through the changes. I canceled the shared credit card. I updated access permissions with the bank. David drafted a letter stating that any financial communication would now go through his office. It was direct, professional, and free of accusation. Signing the new paperwork felt heavier than I expected. Not because it was difficult, but because it marked a boundary I had avoided setting for years. That evening, I stood in line at the grocery store and overheard a conversation behind me. Low voices, familiar words. Family. Control. I paid and left without turning around. At home, I placed the folder David had given me in a drawer and locked it. Everything inside was organized now. Clear, accounted for. The chaos had shape. I realized then that preparation had given me something I had been missing. Not certainty, but agency. Before bed, I sent one final instruction through David's office. A brief note informing Ryan and Ashley that financial matters would be handled formally going forward. No explanations. No justifications. I knew that message would land hard. I knew it might cost me more than money. As I stood in the doorway of the garage looking at the untouched suitcase, I accepted that cost. Whatever response came next would tell me exactly where I stood, and for the first time in a long while I felt ready to see it. I did not have to wait long to see the reaction. 2 days after David's office sent the notice, my phone began to feel heavier in my pocket. It did not ring. It did not buzz with messages from Ryan or Ashley. Instead, it carried silence, the kind that usually means something is happening elsewhere. I first noticed it online. A post from Ashley appeared on my feed, shared by someone I barely knew. It was carefully written, the kind of message that pretends to speak generally while pointing very clearly at one person. She wrote about toxic family dynamics, about the importance of boundaries, about how hard it was to protect her child from controlling influences that refused to respect her role as a mother. No names were mentioned. None were needed. The comments came quickly. Supportive. Sympathetic. People praising her strength. Others sharing similar stories, each one adding weight to a narrative that was no longer hers alone. I read it once, then closed the app. I did not comment. I did not defend myself. I understood now that responding would only give the story more shape. Ryan said nothing. Not publicly, not privately. His absence from the conversation spoke as loudly as any accusation. Over the next few days, the mood in the neighborhood shifted from careful to cold. Neighbors who once waved now nodded without meeting my eyes. Conversations ended when I approached. At the mailbox, Susan Miller from the HOA stopped me and smiled the way people do when they have rehearsed what they are about to say. She mentioned that family conflicts could be stressful for everyone involved. She suggested I consider giving young families space to work things out on their own. Her words were gentle, but the message underneath was clear. The community had already decided who needed to adjust. I thanked her and walked away. Arguing would have been pointless. This was not about facts. It was about comfort. At home, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to understand what I was seeing. Ashley was not just protecting herself. She was protecting control. Control over money, over image, over the story people told about her life. Losing access to my finances had shaken something deeper than pride. It had threatened stability, the kind she had grown used to, without ever acknowledging its source. Once I saw that the pieces fit together too easily. I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see how far the narrative would go without resistance. Each post, each comment revealed more about its purpose. It was not asking for peace. It was asking for validation. Then the email arrived. It came from the financial institution managing Lucas's education account. The subject line was neutral, almost apologetic. A routine notification about an attempted change to the account. A withdrawal request flagged for review. I opened it slowly, already knowing what I would find. The request had been made online, using credentials that should not have been active. The amount was not small. It was enough to cover personal expenses framed as temporary, necessary, justified. I felt a tightening in my chest, sharper than anything I had felt so far. This crossed a line I had not realized I was still hoping would remain intact. I forwarded the message to David without adding a word. Then I sat back and closed my eyes. Lucas's face came to mind, the way he concentrated when he was trying to tie his shoes, his small hands clumsy but determined. That account was never meant to be part of an argument. It was meant to be a promise. The realization settled heavily. Silence was no longer neutral. It was becoming permission. I thought about everything I had lost in the past few weeks. My place in the family, my standing in the neighborhood, the assumption that goodwill would be met with goodwill. None of it compared to the idea that my grandson's future could be treated as another resource to tap when things felt tight. The narrative Ashley had built was gaining momentum, but narratives have a weakness. They rely on perception, not proof, and perception can shift the moment it runs into something solid. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood, not to confront anyone, just to move. The air was warm and still. Houses glowed softly as lights came on inside. Families gathered for dinner. Ordinary life continued, indifferent to the stories being told in its name. I realized then that this was no longer about defending myself. It was about drawing a line that could not be blurred by tone or implication. If I continued to wait, I would be complicit in whatever came next. I returned home and sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where so many of these realizations had unfolded. I opened the folder from David's office and reviewed what could be done, what had to be done, and what could no longer be delayed. Protecting my own dignity had felt important. Protecting Lucas's future felt necessary. I did not act yet. But I understood that the window for quiet observation was closing. Whatever happened next would not stay contained within posts and whispers, and if I wanted to ensure that one innocent person was not caught in the fallout, I would have to step forward, not with anger, but with clarity and resolve. The decision I reached did not arrive with drama. It arrived with a checklist. The morning after I acknowledged the window was closing, I called David and told him to proceed. Not aggressively, correctly. We began with the education account. The attempted withdrawal had been blocked, flagged as a first attempt, and stopped automatically. David tightened the controls anyway. Two-factor verification. Written authorization only. No exceptions. When it was done, I felt a quiet relief that surprised me. Next came the property. Years earlier, I had helped Ryan with a portion of the purchase structured in a way that made sense at the time. Informal, trust-based. David laid out the options and I chose the one that closed the door cleanly. A quick sale through escrow to a cash buyer. Proper notices, proper filings. Texas procedure followed to the letter. There was no rush, but there was momentum. Documents moved, signatures were placed, funds settled where they belonged. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. Each step removed another assumption that no longer served me. Ryan called 3 days later. I was in the garage when my phone rang. I recognized the number and let it ring once longer than necessary before answering. His voice sounded different, tight, unsteady. He did not start with small talk this time. He asked what was happening. He said things were moving that he did not understand. He said the house felt unstable, like something had shifted under his feet. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, waiting for reassurance, I told him calmly that I had made changes to protect myself and to protect Lucas. I said I was not taking anything from him. I was stepping back from arrangements that depended on silence to function. He asked why I had not talked to him first. I said I had tried, more than once. He did not argue with that. We agreed to meet later that afternoon. Not at his house, not at mine. A quiet place halfway between. Neutral ground. Ryan arrived early and sat hunched forward at the table, hands wrapped around a coffee he was not drinking. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not overworked. Disoriented. He asked again what this was all for. I told him I was not punishing anyone. I was correcting a pattern. I told him I had spent years making myself useful to the point where usefulness replaced respect. I said I would no longer participate in that trade. He looked down at the table and nodded slowly. He said Ashley was angry. He said she felt blindsided. I asked him if he felt the same. He hesitated, then shook his head. He said he felt confused. He said things had been easier when he did not have to choose sides. When he could let decisions happen around him. I told him that silence is a choice even when it feels like avoidance. Especially then. The realization came to him in pieces. Not all at once. He mentioned messages he had not seen until recently. Financial alerts he assumed were handled. Posts that did not reflect conversations he remembered having. He spoke about it slowly, as if saying it aloud might make it real. He asked me if I thought Ashley had manipulated him. I told him manipulation rarely announces itself. It works by convenience, by relief, by letting someone else do the thinking until thinking feels unnecessary. That was the moment his face changed. Not anger. Recognition. He admitted he had let things slide because confronting them felt harder than ignoring them. He said he had convinced himself that keeping the peace meant doing nothing. I told him peace that depends on one person carrying the cost is not peace. It is postponement. He asked if this meant I was cutting him off. I shook my head. I told him this was not about revenge. It was about consequences. Consequences that arrive when boundaries are crossed and not repaired. I said I was still his father. That had not changed. But I would no longer act against my own interests to preserve an image that excluded me. I would not fund a narrative that painted me as a problem while treating my support as a solution. He sat back and exhaled like someone realizing the room had been too quiet for too long. He said he did not know how to fix what he had allowed. I told him fixing it was his work now, not mine. When we stood to leave, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker. More aware. Driving home, I thought about how quickly roles can reverse when reality presses in. I had not set out to teach a lesson. I had set out to stop teaching myself the wrong one. That evening, I walked through the house and noticed how little had changed and how much had. The folder from David sat locked in the drawer. The garage remained quiet. The suitcase stayed where it was untouched. Ryan had not solved anything yet. Neither had I, but something essential had shifted. He had seen the cost of doing nothing. I had stopped paying it. As I turned off the lights, I understood that consequences had begun to do what arguments never could. And whatever came next would test not just intentions, but integrity. What came next did not explode. It unraveled. Over the following weeks, the tension that had been contained inside their marriage began to show at the edges. Not publicly at first. Quiet arguments that stretched late into the night. Missed calls. Separate arrivals at places where they used to present as a unit. Ryan mentioned it in fragments, never directly, as if naming it might make it permanent. Ashley did not stay quiet. She moved quickly the way people do when they believe speed equals control. Legal paperwork followed. Requests. Demands framed as protection. She was preparing for leverage, not resolution. But preparation leaves traces. David kept me informed without dramatizing anything. Financial records. Digital access logs. The stored signature. Each piece on its own might have looked like carelessness. Together they formed a pattern that could not be explained away as misunderstanding. Ashley had assumed silence would continue to work in her favor. She had underestimated what documentation does when it speaks for itself. Through all of it, I kept my focus narrow. Lucas. His education account was locked down fully now. No shared access, no gray areas. Monthly statements went directly to me and to David. I did not tell Lucas about any of it. He did not need to carry adult conflicts on his small shoulders. Protection is quiet when it is done right. The neighborhood noticed changes before they understood them. The posts stopped. The sympathetic comments slowed. People who had nodded politely before now lingered uncertain. Narrative loses its grip when it is not fed regularly. At the mailbox, someone asked how Lucas was doing. Not how the situation was. Just Lucas. I answered honestly. He was doing well. That seemed to matter. Ryan called one evening and asked if we could talk. Not about logistics. About everything. His voice sounded different again. Less frantic. More grounded. We met at the same place as before. Neutral. Familiar. He looked worn but clearer. The kind of clarity that follows a decision you have been avoiding. He told me Ashley was preparing to file motions she believed would give her leverage. He told me her attorney had questions she could not answer cleanly. He did not defend her. He did not accuse her either. He simply stated what was happening. Then he did something I did not expect. He apologized. Not with qualifiers. Not with explanations about pressure or confusion. He said he was sorry for staying silent when his silence had a cost. He said he was sorry for letting others speak for him. He said he was sorry for treating my presence as optional and my support as guaranteed. I did not interrupt. I let the words come out in the order he needed them to. He said he had believed avoiding conflict was the same as being neutral. He said he understood now that neutrality had a price and he had let me pay it. Hearing him say that felt heavier than anger ever could. I told him I accepted the apology. Not because everything was fixed, but because he had finally taken responsibility for his part in breaking it. I told him forgiveness did not mean erasing consequences. It meant naming them honestly. He asked what came next. I told him that depended on the choices he made going forward. Choosing sides was not the point. Choosing integrity was. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer feels tense, just real. Driving home, I thought about how easily people confuse winning with relief. There was no victory in what had happened, no satisfaction in seeing a marriage strain under the weight of its own distortions. What I felt instead was a loosening, as if a knot I had been carrying without noticing had finally been untied. The truth had been spoken aloud. That mattered. At home, I walked into the garage and looked at the suitcase one more time. It had been weeks since I packed it. Dust had settled along the edges. It looked smaller now, less symbolic, more like an object that belonged to a different version of me. I did not feel triumphant. I felt lighter. The situation was not over. Legal processes move slowly. Relationships take time to heal if they heal at all. But something essential had shifted. The story being told about me no longer floated unchallenged. It had weight now, context, names attached to actions. I realized then that choosing sides had never been the goal. Choosing truth had been. And truth once named carries its own quiet authority. As I turned off the lights and headed inside, I understood that whatever came next would not be about retaliation or proving a point. It would be about living in a way that did not require silence to survive. The morning the cruise departed, I woke before the sun and listened to the house breathe. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. Somewhere down the coast, a ship was pulling away from the dock horns, sounding schedules unfolding. I was not there. I did not need to be. Lucas was already awake when I pulled into his driveway. He stood on the porch with a small backpack and a fishing rod he could barely manage, eyes bright with the kind of excitement that has nothing to do with plans changing. Ryan met me at the door and nodded. We did not talk much. We did not need to. Some things were still tender. Some things were simply understood. We drove north to a quiet lake I had known for years. The water lay flat and gray under the early light. Lucas asked questions the whole way. About fish, about boats, about whether the water ever got tired of being still. I answered what I could and let the rest hang in the air. At the shore, he cast his line with the seriousness of a man twice his age. I watched his hands and thought about all the ways children learn by observing who stands beside them. He caught nothing for a while and did not mind. When he finally felt a tug, he froze, unsure. I put my hand over his and guided him gently. The fish was small. We let it go. I checked my phone once and put it away. There were no new messages from Ashley. There were updates from David, procedural contained. Ryan had begun making his own arrangements. Not declarations. Steps. Ashley was facing the consequences of choices documented in black and white. Not revenge. Process. Nothing returned to what it was. That was not the goal. Boundaries were now visible where there had once been assumptions. That was enough. Later, as Lucas skipped stones across the water, I thought about money and how strange it is that people believe it defines outcomes. I had not reclaimed what I spent. I had reclaimed my say. I had reclaimed the right to decide where my support ended and where my dignity began. Ryan stood a little apart, watching his son. He looked older than he had a month ago, not worn down, sharpened. We spoke quietly about school schedules and weekends, about how things would work now. He did not ask me to step back. He did not ask me to step in. We agreed on clarity. When the sun climbed higher, Lucas grew tired and sat beside me, leaning his shoulder against my arm. He asked if we could come back next week. I told him yes. The answer felt uncomplicated. On the drive home, I passed a sign pointing toward the highway that led south, toward the port, toward the version of myself that once believed inclusion was proof of worth. I did not feel bitterness. I felt distance. At home, the garage waited. The suitcase was still there. I opened it and removed the clothes one by one, folding them back into drawers. The toy car went on the shelf. The space cleared, and so did something else. That evening, I cooked dinner and ate at the table without scrolling or planning. I thought about how easy it is to confuse belonging with permission. For years, I had allowed others to decide when I was welcome, when I was useful, when I should stay quiet. I had mistaken patience for virtue and silence for peace. I am still a father, still a grandfather, still a man who believes in family. Those things did not disappear when I stopped funding a narrative that excluded me. They became steadier. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself in any part of it, I want to ask you something. Where are your boundaries and who defined them? At what point did support turn into expectation? And did you notice when it happened? What would change if you decided that respect was not something you requested, but something you required? You do not have to burn bridges to stand upright. You do not have to win to be whole. Sometimes the most meaningful shift is choosing to live without asking for permission to exist in your own life. I stood in the doorway of the garage one last time and turned off the light. The house settled. The night moved in. I do not need to be included to know who I am.